Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, April 7th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, as agencies take on new guidance and new expectations, accountability is being reshaped across the government. OMB's latest IT memo echoes years of policy, but signals some important shifts agencies can't ignore. Plus, the Cost Accounting Standards Board is carrying out a congressional mandate with comments now open. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Trump administration is once again pursuing deep spending cuts for federal civilian agencies as part of its budget request for next year. Overall, it's proposing a 10% cut to non-defense discretionary spending. The White House is also doubling down on reorganization plans that Congress ignored in a comprehensive spending plan for this year. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more detail. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
Give us the big picture. What are the non-defense cuts that are being proposed in this president's budget?
Right. So overall, this is a pretty sizable cut to federal civilian spending here. To put it one way, the budget proposal would cut discretionary spending at 10 of the cabinet level agencies and increase budgets for the remaining 5. It's not always where you think it would be. For example, the Department of Homeland Security would actually get a year-over-year decrease in fiscal 2027 compared to current levels. But let's also keep in mind that there's multiple buckets of money at work here because, of course, DHS is also has on tap the vast sums of money available to them in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that's one other place to look at there. And they're, of course, flush with money there. But by and large, there's also a real doubling down from the administration on some reorganization proposals that didn't get off the ground in the last budget cycle, and they are pursuing them once again.
What plans are back on the table in this budget submission?
Another notable one here is over at the Department of Health and Human Services. There was this push to create this new Administration for a Healthy America, or AHA. This was championed by Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy. And what this would have done is that it would have merged programs from a bunch of different places, from the CDC, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, and the HHS Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. This never really got off the ground during the last budget cycle, but this is back on the agenda for this budget cycle. And it wouldn't be just moving these programs all together. There would be sizable cuts. All things considered here, they're looking at about $5 billion in program cuts to all of those things that would move to AHA. And one other one to highlight here is one that's, I guess you could say, half in the works. And this is merging of the Wildland Fire Service operations at both Interior and the Agriculture Department. I say half because the Interior Department already did a reorganization of sorts. They blazed ahead with a merging of their programs, their wildland fire programs. They existed under different bureaus and offices, and they now report up to one single office that then reports up to the secretary. The overall goal here, though, was to have everything in USDA's Forest Service and everything in the Interior Department work under one roof. And that is yet to happen here. Congress actually said no thank you to that in the last budget cycle. They continue to separate them as separate budget items. And they said that, sorry, no, we're actually not going to endorse that. So Interior at this point is going it alone. But the budget request makes clear that the Trump administration really does want a single wildland fire agency, and that these resources from Interior and the Forest Service should be combined.
Jory, one of the agencies that has the biggest whiplash from administration to administration is the IRS. What does this budget have in store for them?
Yeah, so the IRS, more bad news for them at this point. This is being proposed a $1.4 billion cut from existing levels, and they've already been on the decline. This is a pretty severe cut for an agency that really has been shrinking considerably under the Trump administration. They lost about 27% of their workforce last year. This is largely through voluntary separations and early retirements, fearing that there would be broader reductions in force that would be non-voluntary. Those never came to pass, but still the cuts are being felt. And as far as workforce cuts, those are going to be also pursued as well, in addition to what we've already seen. This would be a further 1.5% cut to taxpayer services. They already saw a 22% cut to staff last year, and this would be also about a 4% cut to IRS enforcement. This is all happening at a time when the IRS concedes that it doesn't have enough employees for taxpayer services, that so much so that they have moved people from their IT and human resources operations. They've put them on involuntary 120-day details to man the front lines, to assist in answering the calls, assist in the processing of incoming tax returns, to make sure everything can get done in an acceptable time frame.
One of the other agencies that's often under the microscope is the Veterans Administration. What are you seeing for them?
Right. So they would be getting a substantial increase in money. They would get a nearly $145 billion increase in discretionary funding. But what's notable here is that there's fewer employees on the job in its healthcare operations to do all of the work that's being proposed here. And these are pretty substantial cuts. We did see last year that the administration successfully got about 30,000 employees out of the organization. This is, again, through voluntary incentives and early retirements. Those are positions that they don't expect to fill. These are people that they let walk out the door. They are going to be strategically hiring for things like doctors, nurses, clinicians, those frontline medical personnel. They're going to make sure that those are still staffed up. But there are, of course, constraints on hiring overall because the VA says that in the past, under the Biden administration, that the VA was a little too trigger happy with the hiring, that they were hiring in such large numbers, but not really focusing on where those hires were. And so they want to make sure that they pretty much have the workforce that they have, but shift them to places where there's a more acute need.
Jory, are you seeing any through line in the budget document for these agencies that are going to experience smaller workforces yet larger workloads? How's the work going to get done? Is this an AI problem?
Well, there is some acknowledgement here in some level that they think AI will be some way to address the workforce gap, address the work that isn't being done by virtue of the fact that there are fewer employees on the job here. Of course, this did come up in the portion with the IRS, but the IRS also lost a lot of its IT talent, as we've discussed previously. I guess the one big through line here is that a lot of this does arrive on Congress's doorstep at the end of the day. They still control the power of the purse, and to the extent that Congress has been let in on administration reorg plans to date, this is now something that they have to be aware of. They have to know the ins and outs, the pros and cons, things that they're comfortable with and not comfortable with. And at the end of the day, they get to sign off on what the budget lines look like and what these agencies get to do.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for this breakdown.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, OMB's latest IT memo echoes years of policy, but signals some important shifts agencies can't ignore. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. OMB Memo M2610 revisits familiar themes around CIO authority and IT governance, but with sharper expectations for transparency, reporting, and shared responsibility. The question now is what agencies are expected to do differently and how this guidance changes day-to-day decision-making for federal IT leaders. Here to walk us through the key points of the memo is former GSA administrator and senior fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting, Emily Murphy. Emily, thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you, as always, Terry.
There was an interesting memo from OMB that came out on March 31st, reinforcing transparency, accountability, and oversight of federal technology. or in the vernacular, M2610. Let's start with the high-level view of this. Why did they feel like they needed to issue this memo?
So there are two parts of the memo, and I think there might be different reasons for each part. But when I read it, the first part seems to be really reinforcing FITARA, that we want the CIOs to be in charge of IT spending. We want them to have insight into it. We want government-wide insight into it. But it does seem to replicate the data that should be in the IT dashboard already. So it suggests that maybe that there's something that's missing from that IT dashboard. And then the second part is a lot more data on the contracting and how we're getting to the contracts and utilization and transactional data and all sorts of, the second part was really a fascinating part to that memo.
Well, let's dig into those pieces separately and take the first one. What's going on with the data around IT spend? Why would they need to collect it again or separately?
Well, it's asking for two types of data. First of all, the contracts, any dollar value, anything else that a CIO of a CFO Act agency other than the Department of War has signed off on personally. Now, under FITARA, they're supposed to be signing off on all of them. So it's an interesting question. And then also for data on anything that they've delegated to someone else within the agency, if it's touching the public. So if there is a question of, all right, do we feel that there's stuff that's slipping through the cracks? And that's what it seems to be suggesting, is that there's some data that OMB wants to be tracking. And it's an attempt to really empower the CIOs to get their hands around that spending and collect data. But one question I had is how they're going to collect all this data and what are they going to do with it? Because it could be a lot of data.
I'm speaking with Emily Murphy. She's Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and former GSA Administrator. Well, let's take part two, the part that you found fascinating. What's so fascinating there?
Well, so part two goes in with, my heart's in contracting. So it was the contracting data that they're asking for. So when you look at part two of the memo, they start to say that we want transactional level, so utilization data and pricing data on all IT purchases, software, hardware, services. And we want them no matter how you're buying them. It doesn't matter if we're buying it directly from the OEM, if you're buying it from a reseller, a wholesaler, integrator, we don't care. We want all this data. And we want you to change actually even how you're putting your contracts out there to say that the data has to be collected. And it has to be given no matter, you've got to put a clause in your contract saying that it has to be shared with OMB and GSA, no matter who the contracting agency is. So last year when GSA was doing a lot of its defend the spend, some contractors pushed back and said, wait a second, GSA, we don't have privity of contract with you. We can't give you this data without the contracting agency giving us permission. This is going to say, nope, GSA can reach in, OMB can reach in and grab that data. GSA has made the move towards transactional data across all the schedules. So it was already collecting some or much of this data. Now we're going to see it applying to all the contracts out there on IT. So it really seems to be an attempt to figure out how much we're paying for things, how much we're using them. In some ways, it's getting ahead of the SAMOSA Act that Congress has been considering on software licenses. It also, though, it seems to be trying to look at and say, all right, you've got GSA running their OneGov deals. You're seeing Army came out with its enterprise licensing deals. Other agencies are starting to talk about doing this. It seems to be a way that they're going to go in and try and dig in and see which deals are really good deals and how do we leverage those.
Emily, it seems like they could get overwhelmed with a tsunami of data. Do they have the collection mechanisms and systems to get all of this together and make sense of it?
Well, so they specify that the data has to be submitted in a machine readable format, which I think suggests they're going to use this as a test of the AI tools they've got and see what they can scrape from the data that way and really try and figure out the range of prices they're paying, but also if they've got licenses they're not using, how do they rescope their contracts? This could also signal a return to those defend the spend discussions of last year and a return to the memos we saw going out from GSA last fall on reseller markups and so this could be giving us a lot more data, so you see the variability in pricing depending on how things are bought.
Well, if you're then an agency CIO or a contracting officer, what do you need to do to be responsive to this? How quickly do you need to respond to this?
They've got pretty tight time frames around all of these. So they're saying that each for top level CIO covered agencies, they have to be submitting their data on what they've signed off on within 30 days. And then when it comes to eliminating the second part of it, the time frame on it is also a pretty tight turnaround. So I think it also is a 30-day turnaround on their data. It's not as explicit, but it seems to be, since they're putting it into contracts, they're looking at this as a ongoing data requirement. This isn't the testing of data that they're doing in part one. Part two is a ongoing way where we're going to evaluate contract data, and TDR data is done on a monthly basis. So this could be an ongoing scraping of data.
Any concern about the workforce that's available to take on this extra reporting requirement? CIO shops were downsized, contracting offices were downsized over the last year.
And that's where it's going to become particularly interesting. The first part of it, it's going to require, it's what has the CIO touched? What has the CIO's delegate touched? And, and getting that information in. So that's going to be a little less simple to automate. Whereas instead, with the second part on eliminating information silos in technology contracts, that's going to is really going to be a TDR mechanism. And so they're going to have a portal to submit it. I assume it'll be very similar to the portal GSA's already created. And then you're going to have the challenge for contracting officers of inserting the new clause into the contracts, but that's a fairly standard thing for contracting officers to be doing. It is one more thing that they're going to be doing as we're entering the third quarter of the fiscal year. So just as things usually are starting to speed up in federal contracting, we're going to do a little bit more analysis and a little more digging around in that data. It could be a really useful data set at the end of the day, assuming that it's the right parameters are applied to it.
Well, it will take them a few months, I suppose, to get enough data to start to look at and draw some conclusions. What sort of timeline would you be expecting for OMB and GSA to then say, okay, we've been looking at this data, we've been collecting it, now here's some new guidance?
I would expect that you're going to see on the first part of it that we will see something, by the end of the fiscal year. We'll either see an extension of this or we'll see new guidance on the role of CIOs in IT purchases and IT systems. On the second part, though, I think that it'll only take them a few months to start saying, all right, here's what we've determined is within the range. If anyone's got data that's outside of that range, speak up now. And I think you're going to see that start to inform contracting strategy. I would suspect that it could also feed into, in the Revolutionary Fire overhaul, in Part 8, there was a 8.104A suggested that there could become, that OFPP could designate certain contracts as required use contracts. If this could be a way of identifying which contracts or what range of contracts fall into that required use space as well, which ones are really the best deals. And I think it's going to give us some actually very interesting data on the difference between OEM and reseller pricing and whether or not resellers actually cost more than OEMs at the end of the day.
I've been speaking with Emily Murphy. She's Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and former GSA Administrator. Emily, thanks as always for walking us through this.
Thank you, Terry. Great being with you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the administration's new cyber strategy bets that coordination, not regulation, drives better security outcomes. But first, the Cost Accounting Standards Board is carrying out a congressional mandate with comments now open. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Cost Accounting Standards Board's proposal implements 2026 NDAA language aimed at simplifying CAS without losing oversight. With comments due soon, agencies and contractors are weighing how the rule reshapes compliance, audits, and long-term contract management. We'll walk through the proposed rule and what happens next, with partner at Haynes Boone, Dan Ramish. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
We talked back when the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act first came out about the new cost accounting standards thresholds that were included there. And the Cost Accounting Standards Board is now out with a draft rule to implement the law. Comments due April 20th. We'll dig into those particulars, but before we do, just refresh our memory. What is the problem that the NDAA and the new rule are trying to solve?
So, Terry, the cost accounting standards have been in place since the 1970s, and the requirements are among the most onerous regulatory burdens for government contractors. They provide prescriptive requirements for how contractors are required to measure, assign, and allocate costs. And it's one of the areas where operations, the accounting requirements are most different from the commercial world. And so there's been a broader deregulatory effort within government contracts, and CAS has been one of the focus areas because it is more onerous than some of the other areas. And so there have been efforts on the one hand, to make changes to conform the cost accounting standards to GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles, partly to make the accounting more similar to the commercial world. But there have also been efforts to limit which contractors through their contracts are subject to the cost accounting standards. And so that's the threshold piece is paring back the contracts and subcontracts that will be subject to CAS.
Well, the threshold piece is certainly the big headline here, changing the exemption level up to $35 million and the jump to $100 million for full CAS coverage. What does that change actually mean for contractors?
Well, so there's some nuances here. The board, the Cost Accounting Standards Board, is trying to balance, on the one hand, trying to have transparency and accountability in how the federal government is spending its dollars, and on the other hand, it is promoting this deregulatory agenda with the administration. But all of these new thresholds were set intending to reduce the number of entities that are subject, for example, to full CAS coverage, while still having transparency into most of the dollars. So the board estimated, for example, the full CAS coverage, which requires more compliance with all 19 cost accounting standards, so is really the full banana, so to speak. The changes in the full CAS coverage threshold would remove nearly 30% of entities subject to full coverage, while maintaining, by the board's estimate, nearly 99% of the dollars that have been subject to it. So a good trade-off as far as reducing the burden without really narrowing the government's insights and into the contracts and having the assuredness of these requirements.
The law and the rule also both tackle the disclosure statement threshold, raising that to $100 million and eliminating the 30% segment exemption. Tell us how that is going to play out in practice.
So disclosure statements generally track with the full CAS coverage. They're separate thresholds, but full CAS coverage threshold was increased to 100 million. Disclosure statement threshold, it actually wasn't addressed in the NDAA. That's actually only in the CAS regulations, but the CAS Board found that it made sense to also increase the threshold for disclosure statements, which is one of the major requirements of CAS and is more involved. They eliminated some of the other suggestions, some of the other exemptions. I mean, there has been a standing exemption for segments for which CAS covered contracts accounted for fewer than 30% of total segment sales and less than $10 million. The CAS Board found that shouldn't be necessary based on the higher thresholds. And that was following the recommendations of the last big blue ribbon procurement reform initiative, the Section 809 panel.
I'm speaking with Dan Ramish. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Dan, the board in this rule also finally addresses what's been a sore point around CAS for indefinite delivery contracts, but maybe not as clearly as folks would have liked. So tell us what's going on there.
Well, so I mentioned the Section 809 panel made various recommendations about CAS. One of the recommendations they made was to clarify coverage of indefinite delivery contracts. So, of course, when there's an IDIQ contract, there is a very low minimum amount that's established, really just to provide for consideration. And then there's a high ceiling. And in many cases, the actual awarded orders will never approach the ceiling on an indefinite delivery contract. And so the Section 809 panel's recommendation was to just have CAS coverage addressed at the order level for indefinite delivery contracts. Now, the board looked at the data in FPDS and said, actually, it makes sense to divide how indefinite delivery contracts are treated based on whether the contract is single award or multiple award. They said that for multiple award contracts, which seemed to be the focus of the 809 panel, the amounts that were actually ordered under the contract didn't approach the ceiling, so the ceiling wasn't a good value to compare against the thresholds. But that for single award contracts, often the ordered amounts were close to the ceiling, or in many cases more than 90% of the ceiling. So they felt that it was fair to use the overall contract ceiling value for single award contracts, but stick with the order level assessment for multiple award.
Are there issues related to CAS that the rule doesn't specifically address or resolve?
So a few things on that, Terry. There were some additional reforms that are specified in the NDAA that aren't addressed in this proposed rulemaking. It looks like the CAS Board kind of decided to take it in stages. So there is a provision that talks about exempting portions of covered contracts and subcontracts, where there are a couple of established exemptions. For example, contracts for commercial products or services, prices set by law or regulation, or fixed price contracts with adequate price competition where there's no certified cost or pricing data. The NDAA calls for, if there are portions of contracts that fall within those exemptions, allowing those portions to be exempt from CAS. And so that hasn't been implemented yet. There are also some changes to the composition of the CAS Board and the operation of the CAS Board that are going to be addressed separately, presumably. And the other big issue that contractors are going to be watching is there is a rewrite called for under the NDAA of the rules on contract price adjustments for changes in cost accounting practices. And that is kind of separate from the coverage issue, at least. So that also will be subject to a follow-on regulation.
I've been speaking with Dan Ramish. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Dan, thanks as always. Appreciate you walking us through this.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the administration's new cyber strategy bets that coordination, not regulation, drives better security outcomes. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. More than 80% of U.S. critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, putting public-private collaboration at the center of the administration's cyber strategy for America. We'll examine what that partnership needs to look like in practice with John Miller of the Information Technology Industry Council. John, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Terry, it's great to be here. Thank you.
The Trump administration issued its long-awaited cyber strategy for America in early March. ITI was involved in providing input to that and commented on it when it came out. So you've had a few weeks to dig into it a little bit more. From ITI's perspective, what are the big points around industry implementation in this strategy?
Thanks for the question, Terry. I mean, I guess I would just say, first of all, at the top line, I think from the ITI perspective and the industry perspective, I think there's a lot to like in the strategy. It's certainly very positive. I think if we look at it in particular, kind of in comparison to some of the prior strategies we've seen, it really it seems to be focused on empowering the private sector, in a few different ways, kind of shifting from compliance to a more operational partnership model is one of the ways that I think it's doing that. There's a pillar around deregulation and more common sense rules, which is a bit of a departure from some of what we saw in the last administration, where there were software liability mandates that were put into effect. And, I think there are really some market opportunities around federal procurement, because there's a major focus on modernizing federal networks in the strategy, which is creating, to create a significant demand for, various high-tech solutions, not only AI and quantum, but things like zero trust. I kind of didn't exactly answer your question about implementation because I think that's probably one of the questions as to what the implementation details are, because unlike in some of the previous strategies that we've seen, there at least to date has not really been an implementation plan published, right? So I think that's one of the questions that is lingering in some folks' minds.
Well, you laid out a great roadmap there. I want to take each of those traffic turns one at a time. Let's start with deregulation, because ITI has long argued that the fragmentation of cyber regulations really slows down both compliance and cybersecurity. Where does this strategy meaningfully change how federal cyber requirements are coordinated and maybe reduced in practice?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I think for as long as I've been working in cybersecurity, which is too long, probably. I mean, I think we've been talking about regulatory streamlining, and the reality is that we a lot of times, compared to say Europe, the U.S. is not known as being a regulatory environment, perhaps on technology regulation, but that's really not the case in cyber. There are lots and lots of different cyber regulations, particularly when we layer on the various sectoral regulators, right? And, the federal procurement space and everything like that. So, this strategy is very overtly saying, hey, we want to promote common sense regulation, and that, the U.S. is going to aim to streamline cyber regulations and reduce compliance burdens on the private sector. And, with the idea being to allow for greater agility against evolving threats. I mean, what does that mean in practice? One thing is it says, we want to get rid of, costly compliance checklists and move to risk-based or, security, potentially streamlining overlapping regulations, from agencies like CISA and the SEC. I think on that note in particular, one of the potentially really positive aspects is whether we see in the implementation actual streamlining of security incident notification regulations, right? I mean, that was an area that was identified by the last administration, as they're essentially, I think they tallied, they had a cyber incident reporting council that they stood up, and they tallied over 30 different incident reporting notification regulations. And if we can streamline even those alone, it would actually do a lot of good for industry. I mean, one of the questions is what's going to happen to the SEC rule that was put forward during the last administration. Another question is what's going to happen to CERCIA, which was the big incident notification rule that CISA has been working on for a few years, and which is now overdue. So though, in the security incident notification space, it's an area where we could definitely see a lot of progress. I mean, I think that the other one that's noteworthy, particularly when we think about what we saw focus on during the last administration, is around software and software liability, right? You've actually seen a walking back of, for instance, the OMB memo that required contractors to submit a form and some of those related types of requirements. So, potentially a good thing.
I'm speaking with John Miller. He's General Counsel and Senior VP of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. Well, John, let's continue in that discussion of the regulatory environment, because in a world where you have less regulation, that may be good for innovation, that may be good for technology advancement, but you still need a traffic cop to kind of keep everybody aligned and moving in the same direction. And the strategy places a renewed emphasis on coordination through the Office of the National Cyber Director. From industry's perspective, is ONCD staffed and capable? Do they have the capacity to provide that kind of oversight in this new environment?
I think they do. They're certainly not fully staffed up if you compare, again, to the last administration, but I think they would tell you that they're being, nimble and efficient in that regard. I mean, I do think again, I think we're finally seeing ONCD's role as envisioned in the legislation that launched it a few years back starting to materialize. I mean, I think it never quite did in the last administration because you had ONCD, you had CISA, you had the National Security Council, and prominent figures leading all three of those agencies. And I think sometimes from an industry perspective, it was not necessarily clear if there was one traffic cop, as you said, and perhaps there were three. And again, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I do think we have more clarity now as to who is in charge. And so just that alone, I think is positive. I mean, on the flip side, clearly CISA is still going to have a key operational role in the implementation of various parts of the strategy. And, unfortunately, we still haven't kind of seen a fully staffed up CISA yet during this administration. I mean, there's still no permanent director, and we've obviously had a couple of different government shutdowns, including, the ongoing shutdown affecting, all of DHS, which is further depleting their resources. So I'm kind of more concerned with the resources on the CISA side than I am on the ONCD side.
Thinking about those two organizations, you mentioned early on the operational partnership model. 80% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and yet the key government organizations that are needed to partner with industry might be a little less functional than we'd hope. How is this partnership going to play out now?
I mean, that's a great question. One of the other, I think, defining features of the strategy is that, it's really leaning in on the importance of private sector partners and operational collaboration, not only in critical infrastructure, but there's, discussion in there about, offensive cyber and quote unquote unleashing the private sector. I'll put that to the side because that raises a separate set of questions. But getting back to critical infrastructure, one of the things that has hindered operational collaboration, to be candid, during the Trump administration is that we saw a key authority paused, if you will, that the CPAC authorities, the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, which I'm very familiar with because I've participated in various CPAC structures, over the years, including the Sector Coordinating Council, Supply Chain Task Force, as well as others. It's my understanding that those authorities are going to be coming back online very soon. Again, I'll hedge in the sense that nothing is guaranteed until we actually see it happen. But I think that if those authorities come back online, that, from a private sector standpoint, we're all kind of on standby and ready, willing, and able to roll up our sleeves and work with the government to, CISA, ONCD, and other federal partners, across the, critical infrastructure sector risk management agencies. We're ready to go and really roll up our sleeves and implement the plan. And I think that, based on conversations with ONCD, I mean, they know that the hard work remains ahead now that the strategy is out. And, I think there's a great willingness to partner and to do that.
I've been speaking with John Miller. He's General Counsel and Senior VP of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. John, thanks so much for joining me and breaking this all down for us.
Thank you, Terry. It's been a pleasure.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, April 7th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, as agencies take on new guidance and new expectations, accountability is being reshaped across government. OMB's latest IT memo echoes years of policy, but signals some important shifts agencies can't ignore. Plus, the Cost Accounting Standards Board is carrying out a congressional mandate, with comments now open. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Departments of Justice, Veterans Affairs, and Treasury are among the biggest winners when it comes to increasing their technology budgets for 2027. These and a handful of other civilian agencies are driving the Trump administration's record $75.7 billion IT request for next year. Here with more details and analysis of the 2027 IT budget request for civilian agencies is Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
All right, so Justice, VA, and Treasury are among the agencies asking for a lot more funding for technology next year. How much are we talking about?
In some cases, we're talking about quite a bit of money here. Let me just start with VA because they have the biggest increase, about a 62% increase over 2026. That's about $12.2 billion. They'll use money, for example, $800 million of that increase would go to their electronic health records modernization initiative. This is a major priority for the Trump administration. Additional money would go to things like cybersecurity, to modernize the VA's financial management and acquisition system, and of course to provide more digital platforms to serve veterans for finding their medical services or getting mental health services and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of funding there. You're seeing some trails there. When you look at some other agencies, for instance, Treasury also is another big winner. They're looking at about $6.2 billion. That's a 48% increase over 2026. That's a little more difficult to dig into. What I've found is, for instance, the Treasury CIO is asking for about $57 million for their accounts. That's about $21 million increase. You can look at the IRS, another big part of Treasury. They're looking at a pretty big increase for their business systems modernization effort. They're asking for about $728 million. That's up from about $672 million for this year. Interestingly enough, the Treasury Department is asking for less money for their cybersecurity account. They have a very specific enhancement account, and they're actually cutting that by more than half, down to $57 million from about $126 million this year. Now, sometimes that has to do with, hey, we had a big project, we got the project done, we don't need as much money. At the same time, it's a rarity, and we'll probably get to this later, that cybersecurity actually goes down.
Not every agency is seeing an increase, though. Which agencies are going to see smaller IT budgets in 27?
When you look across the board about the 23 CFO Act agencies, we're talking about the civilian agencies now. The administration did not report the Department of Defense's IT budget. That will probably come a little bit later. But 12 are seeing increases, 11 are seeing decreases. Of those that are seeing decreases, a lot of the smaller agencies, for instance, the Office of Personnel Management is seeing a pretty big decrease, which is both surprising but maybe expected too, given how much they're moving some of their services to other agencies. But for instance, the Agriculture Department is seeing a decrease. The Education Department is seeing a decrease. The Department of Health and Human Services is actually seeing a decrease, which is, again, a little surprising. Based on what the Homeland Security Department is seeing across the board, they're actually one of the ones that are seeing an increase, but we are still waiting to see what happens there. When we talk about cybersecurity in a little bit, that's maybe a bit of a surprise. A couple others, Interior Department seeing a decrease as well. And then finally, the Environmental Protection Agency, NASA as well, potentially seeing a decrease in terms of what their requests are. Now, a lot of this is project-based. Some of it is you can't give everyone an increase every year, so somebody's got to cut some funding. So I think that plays into it. But and Social Security Administration is flat. That's a little surprising, too, in the fact that they asked about for $12.7 billion, and they're getting the same amount as this year. Usually you'll see something at least go up for inflation at the very least, because everything costs more every year. But I think what the Trump administration is signaling is there's definitely some areas that they want to invest in, some agencies they feel like need more help, and there's some agencies that you got to work within a different budget line and make it work, because there is a limit to where the money can come from and how to parse it out.
Jason, you just walked through the agency by agency look, but outside of the agency IT budgets, what did the administration request for government-wide technology modernization?
This is also a really interesting signal of what the support is from the administration around certain projects and certain ideas. So, for instance, we all pay attention in the IT sector to something called the Technology Modernization Fund. This is something that Congress had appropriated in 2017. It the authorization had expired. They renewed authorization, and then actually the Senate put money into it for 2026, about $5 million. The administration has zeroed it out for 2027. They're not requesting any new funding. Now, before people go, oh, no, they don't support technology modernization, you have to look deeper into the budget. And when you look at the details, they're expecting, one, agencies to pay back some of the money that they get as loans, and two, there's always leftover money year after year after year. So they actually have a bank account, we'll call it a savings account, of over $330 million that they can use for technology modernization. So the administration, I'm sure, is saying, we have a pretty big nest egg. Why ask for more when there's, again, a limit to what you can do? But the Technology Modernization Fund, according to the way the budget documents read, their estimate is to have about $330 million to spend in 2027. Another program that OMB runs is the IT Oversight and Reform Fund. This is used for the old U.S. Digital Service that has now moved to the U.S. DOGE service. They also use it for certain cybersecurity efforts, and they're requesting $8 million for that fund. That's down from about $12 million that they got in 2026. And then the other big one that we all pay attention to is the Federal Citizen Services Fund. Now this is run out of the General Services Administration, and this funds a lot of the cross-agency initiatives like something like login.gov or something like a shared service that every agency takes advantage of. And GSA is asking for about $71 million for the Federal Citizen Services Fund. That's actually up from $70 million that they got in 2026. And then I'll just point out one other really interesting thing. Well, I mentioned the USDS, the U.S. DOGE service. They actually have their own line item this year, and they're asking for $35 million. Again, this is within OMB. So, and a lot of what the U.S. DOGE service has now morphed into is not cutting programs and cutting certain people, but really they become what the old USDS was doing, which is technology modernization, bringing in experts to help agencies on specific projects and programs. And again, they've asked for about $35 million, up from $29 million this year.
And Jason, you've teased cybersecurity a couple of times. How does the cybersecurity request fit into the broader IT picture?
Generally speaking, cybersecurity is actually down this year from a request perspective. It's down about $200 million at $12.2 billion. That's down from $12.4 billion in 2026, even down, just slightly down from 2025 at 12.28. So you have to go to the next figure on that one. That's a little surprising. Usually what we've seen over the last several decades is up for cybersecurity, especially with concerns about nation-state actors as the attack surface gets bigger. Now you have AI attacks. But, I think what the administration is doing is saying we're going to invest, again, very similar to IT, in certain areas. Now there's some surprises about the agencies that potentially would see cuts. The Health and Human Services, HHS as an example, would see roughly about an $80 million cut, which is a lot of money when you're talking about $820 million cyber budget. The Homeland Security Department also would see about a $200 million cut. Now, a lot of that was they're refocusing the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. They're trying to, if you will, merge some of the secretary offices together. So that may be a reason for some of the cuts. And the Veterans Affairs Department, again, this is maybe the most surprising, would see, again, about a $200 million cut in all. Now, obviously, if some goes down, others go up. So you'll see some increases. The Commerce Department, as an example, would see an increase. You see a place like HUD would see an increase. Justice would see a pretty significant increase, almost $300 million. So again, there's a balancing out among the agencies, I guess, depending on needs and where they are with their zero trust, where they feel like they're seeing attacks from. So again, all this is a request. Congress still will weigh in. There's so much more to learn about, but the initial ideas are laid out.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. So many pieces to watch here, Jason. Thanks for walking us through it.
It's always my favorite time of the year, Terry. Thank you so much.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, OMB's latest IT memo echoes years of policy, but signals some important shifts agencies can't ignore. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from CBS News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.